What's going on? BJ Kissel, that's Benny Heisler. We are at PXG Overland Park with a little pregame show for the Chiefs' third and final preseason game, getting you ready. We'll break it all down right after this.
This is KC Sports Network, proudly presented by Emprise Bank.
What's going on? Like I said, I'm BJ Kissel. That's Benny Heisler. And we are hanging out with our good friends at PXG Overland Park. Benny, I know both of us have gone through the fitting process here at PXG with Alex, Jacob, and the crew. And it's a phenomenal place. If you are into golf, you live anywhere in the KC metro area, come to PXG Overland Park right off 119th Street near Rosanna Square. This is the place to be if you like golf.
Yeah, I think especially given that we're in this bay, state-of-the-art bay in the midst of the Gen 6 Driver Challenge. Over to the other bay, they're doing a fitting right now, so you just hear the swooshes go by. Yeah. It starts to get amped up, especially knowing that the weather finally is going to start to get a little bit more cool. You can get back on the course a little bit more, maybe even walk for a couple holes as opposed to just sitting in the hot cart. But it's always golf season here, and that's what I love about it.
I feel so bad because I went through the fitting, I got the clubs, and I still haven't hit them. They're so nice, and I don't want to get them dirty. I don't want to mess them up or do anything, and so I have not swung them yet. I'm looking for the right, perfect opportunity to get out there and swing them. But I've also, Benny, I don't know if you've gone, I think you had gone through a fitting process before.
Yeah.
I had never done it until this. I've never used the word dispersion so much in my life than I did after I went through the fitting, and the clubs, every time they adjusted them, they just got longer and straighter the whole time I did it. But now I have to go through, relearn how I hit which clubs before I can go back on the course because they're all longer than I've hit in the past.
I know, like it's like a whole different learning experience, which was fun. And the other thing about getting fit here is if you go, like I got a chance to meet with Alex, who's their lead fitter here.
Yeah.
When I got a hold of one, and you know me, I love golf, but I'm not particularly good at it. But when I got a hold of one, when we figured out that the fit was just right, there was no bigger cheerleader for me than Alex. She was giving me high fives, like a full bump. She's like, let's go. So it's fun.
Yeah.
Like golf should be fun. I think a lot of us tend to forget that.
If you came to the KCSN Foundation Golf Tournament, you met Alex. She was the one that was out there having a good old time on the long drive competition. And we'll talk more about the Gen 6 driver competition because I know that they've got some numbers to back up.
Yeah,
they put their money where their mouth is when it comes to their products. And it's two people that have gone through the process telling you if you want new clubs, you want a fitting, you want to learn more about how to get better at golf, no matter how serious you are, come visit the folks at PXG. They will take care of you and have a good time in the process. But Benny, this is a Chiefs pregame show. So let's talk a little bit about the Chiefs and Browns game today. Saw from NFL Network's James Palmer. Weird thing about the third preseason game, you never know how much guys are going to play. Right. You know, there's no game planning. There's not a lot of matchups that the coaches are trying to exploit, things like that. They're still trying to figure out those last few roster spots. But saw from NFL Network's James Palmer just a little bit ago that Deshaun Watson will play for the Browns, expected to play 20 to 25 snaps. So that when you look at it from the Chiefs' perspective, good to know that they're going to be going up against the dude who's going to be the starter, has had some success in the history that we're not going to ignore here.
Right.
But it's not what we're going to talk about today. But it's going to be good for the Chiefs defense to go up against Deshaun Watson.
Yeah, because that's been an entire storyline that I know people have been talking about until they're blue in the face is what's going to happen as a result of this Chiefs pass rush, regardless of whether or not it's just going to be a Chris Jones issue or whether it's going to be the rest of the depth and how everybody else steps up. Interesting note from a betting side, because you know that's kind of what I'm about here with Benny and the bets, is this line opened for Kansas City, BJ, at -2, -2.5. And this line has moved all the way in favor of the Browns. We're now looking at a 12 o'clock start today. Cleveland is a 5-point Cleveland's a 5-point favorite now. We've seen a line move by about 7.5 points. So I think that goes to say that note about Deshaun Watson playing, that's a key difference in trying to evaluate what's going to be happening here with this game. 41's the total. Again, if you're betting totals in the preseason, I suppose if you feel like you have a distinct edge, that's fine. But I think it tells you a little bit more about what you need to know from Kansas City's side. I don't think we're going to see many starters play at all, even though, you know, Andy's talked about it a little bit.
Yeah, we'll get in the second half of the show. We'll get into like a few players that we're excited to watch.
Yeah.
Let's get into some preseason takeaways, just top level. I think on the Chiefs offensive side of the ball, there's a few different ones. I know we're going to talk about Justin Ross. I know there's people right now. He's been one of the top stories. But Benny, for me, coming into this, knowing what we had talked about last offseason, the big moves that were made this offseason, a lot of the big changes, for me, the most impressive thing and the biggest takeaway I have is the Chiefs offensive line, particularly the two tackles with Donovan Smith sliding in and kind of solidifying that left tackle spot, what we've seen throughout preseason, and then Jawan Taylor being really good on the right side. And again, there's only so much you can take away from the preseason, but it has been a great sign with losing two tackles with Andrew Wiley and Orlando Brown Jr. Lots been made about the number of pressures that they both gave up throughout the regular season. They got it done when it mattered, which is the only thing that matters, which should always be brought up with those guys. But in talking about the regular season and just pure overall talent, the two tackles they have now are more talented than the tackles that they had last year.
Yeah. And I think even though you're talking about continuity a lot of the time and how that's so essential when it comes to offensive line play, I think you've also seen over the last few years, they've had to make some changes. They've had guys leave. They've had trades that they were involved with. And then if you feel like, especially in the middle, like right in the middle of the trenches, if Mahomes is feeling comfortable, if on the outside he feels like he can move around. Again, it's preseason. We're not going to see any sort of situation where he's really trying to get outside the pocket, but knowing that he has the two offensive tackles that can allow him to move around the pocket, make some of that magic happen, that's critical for me. I always find it fun when we're talking about all the different running backs and wide receivers that are likely to step up. I mean, we've heard about Deneric Prince for the last handful of weeks. We've also talked about a guy that actually bugged me last year in a couple games that he played for the Bears. So far, he's off to a great start in Kansas City with Amir Smith-Marset. Really bad drop in one of those Bears games, but I thank him now because that allowed Chicago to have that number 1 pick that they traded to Carolina. The Chiefs wide receiver room, it's funny because I think nationally it's very divided, right? It's okay. We're moving on. No Juju Smith-Schuster, but maybe the depth is finally at an area that most people feel comfortable there, where there might be an emergence of Justin Ross. Sky Moore has been an incredibly popular name and a guy that we've talked about on Benny and the Bets as somebody that is likely to exceed his over at 575.5 receiving yards. I think anytime you go in with some sort of new expectation that Kansas City has perhaps the most depth that they've had in the Mahomes era at the wide receiver room, that's certainly going to get a couple people to raise their eyebrows and go, oh, okay. It may not necessarily be the names you know, but if you can get production at all different parts of the area, that's going to take pressure off of Kelsey, who's not getting any younger as well. It opens up for Sky Moore in the middle of the field. I like hearing about all these guys that have stepped up, particularly in the wide receiver room.
Yeah, and I think it was Sam McDowell from the Kansas City Star that wrote an article this week, kind of the case against keeping 7 wide receivers, because it's kind of become, I don't want to say a narrative, but something that's discussed almost like they have to keep 7 wide receivers because it's going to be really difficult if they only keep 6 to cut a guy that I know one of the popular names that Chiefs fans have been saying is going to be cut, Justin Watson. I've gone on record saying I will donate $500 to a reputable charity if Justin Watson does not make this roster. But Andy Reid has never kept 7 wide receivers in his time with the Chiefs. It has been most of the time it's been 5. And then I think a couple of different years, maybe 3 years out of the 10, he's kept 6 wide receivers. So 7 would definitely be a stretch. But again, it's a numbers game across the board. Get in the quarterback situation, very similar with how well we've seen Shane Buechele play. But I want to switch to the other side of the ball before we move on to the second segment, because the player that, I've been most excited to watch, I don't know how much we're going to see him today, but going back to the offseason when the signing was made, and it kind of jumped out to me because I did not think it was a player that the Chiefs could be in on, especially for the contract that got him. But Drew Tranquill, the second they made that pick on a 1-year, $4 million deal for an athletic linebacker who's in I believe his mid-20s, that can run, can cover, and makes plays behind the line of scrimmage, again, for 1 year, $4 million, an absolute steal. Saw it reported that Spags has him as the backup green dot to Nick Bolton. Nick Bolton comes off the field. Drew Tranquill is going to be the one getting everyone lined up. And for a player that's coming in for his first year in this system, to have that responsibility, to have that green dot says a lot about him. And again, those are the types of moves, in my opinion, that when you talk about winning Super Bowls, I'm not saying it's not an important thing to make Patrick Mahomes, but you're making him the highest paid or one of the highest paid players at his position at the time. Those aren't the difficult moves. Those aren't the ones that necessarily, I don't want to say they help you win a Super Bowl, but you need those other role players. You need those other guys. You need the 1 year, $4 million deal, those guys to outperform those contracts. And if he stays healthy, Drew Tranquill, is going to be a player that's going to end up getting a bigger multi-year deal somewhere else after this, in my opinion, and is going to end up with a comp pick with Kansas City if he doesn't end up staying in Kansas City.
Yeah, what's interesting about Tranquil is that he's 28 years old, but he's like a young 28 because he really only started playing in 2019 with the Chargers, and then 2020 only ended up playing in one game. But the last couple of years there, under the radar, strong production, 5 sacks a season ago. Also has the ability to take the football away. Not somebody that you don't trust as a linebacker with their hands. I think, linebackers, especially sometimes whether it's off the ball linebacker, that's changing as a result of like how the league is going. Even, Ryan Poles, former assistant general manager in Kansas City, now the GM of the Bears, went out, signed Jermaine Edmonds, spent money on off the ball linebackers. So you start to wonder at some point, are we going to start to see teams start to zag after everybody else has been zigging? And it's not to say that that's where Tranquil is going to be, but he's versatile. He's got really good instincts. That's part of the reason that they buy into him as a leader. If he does get a multi-year deal, it'd be great to see it in Kansas City because you at least know his fit with the defensive team. If Bolton goes down for any reason, he can lead by example. And I don't know how much time he'll play. I don't think he'll be in there for much, if at all, but I do think it was a great signing just because they identified him and they got him in a contract that fit for the team at this point in time.
Yeah. And again, we're not talking, those are top preseason takeaways, not necessarily about the game today and talking about Drew Tranquil, but a player I'm excited to see. Again, a crowd favorite, defensive player in Arrowhead, making plays on the other side of the line of scrimmage, tackles for loss, plays in coverage is exactly what you want to see. It's the kind of thing that gets Arrowhead going. And so that's why I feel like he's going to be a crowd favorite. Again, that contract, just chef's kiss from Brett Veach. Well done on that one. Now let's talk about another player in the contract situation that we're not chef's kissing yet.
No.
And it's the big one that everybody's been talking about. We can't talk about preseason takeaways and not talk about the fact that the best player on their defense is not here in Chris Jones. Seen some comments in the chat room. Please bring in those comments. We can see them. We'll bring them up on the screen. We'll react to those. But Benny, you're a betting guy. Obviously, you run the whole betting program here at KC Sports Network. If you were a betting man, do you believe Chris Jones will be on the field week 1 for the Chiefs against the Detroit Lions?
I don't know if he'll be on the field for week 1. I anticipate maybe mid to late September. At some point, things will get done. And I think where the player may have a little bit more of an opportunity here is to basically see what happens on the field, right? If they are desperate for Chris Jones, if they just feel like they're not getting the production, they're not getting pressure on the quarterback, if it just becomes abundantly clear that for the Chiefs to feel like they have the best chance to put themselves in a position to compete for a Super Bowl, obviously we know it starts with 15 and ends with 15, but it matters. And so I think if you miss a couple of games, that either provides more leverage for Jones or he recognizes, it's not for long. It's the NFL. I better get my ass over here. And I got to put myself in a situation where I can still get a good contract for next year without missing too many games. I will never, and maybe this is an unpopular take, I will never doubt a player going for what's best for them long term. You understand the security. You understand one play, it can all be done. But I do think he recognizes his value, and he's also at a premium paid position. So regardless of the franchise tag, he's playing out the game based on good advice from his agent. And I will say this, I think what Mahomes said, earlier in the week, that he's not here now, but we'll welcome him back with open arms. I think it kind of tells you maybe subtly, of course they want him back, and they're not going to do anything to put themselves in a position where, that relationship gets severed, knowing his importance to that team.
I wonder, and I'm going to probably talk out of both sides of my mouth throughout this whole thing, and I'll try to explain my take on this as best I can, because I try to explain on Twitter, and it's a nuanced take, so it's hard. I will never blame. First of all, players should use the leverage they have when they have it. I know a lot 100%. Of people say he signed the contract, he should live it out, and he should play out his contract. Do you say the same thing when a player gets cut after 3 years into a 5-year deal?
Correct.
Players don't have a lot of leverage. They need to use it when they can. I believe Chris Jones, and the problem with this situation is I think both sides are completely right and justified in their position.
Right.
I think Chris Jones deserves, and I really wish we knew the contract that was offered. I think it would change everyone's perspective if when Ian Rappaport says the Chiefs offered a big deal, but it wasn't enough. If fans knew what that deal was and they could kind of make their own determination, I think we're holding on to Patrick Mahomes coming out saying publicly, I took less money so you can stay here, and admitting he told Chris that. Chris tweeting out, I'm a Chief for life. I'm not going anywhere. Those things are kind of souring fans, in my opinion, because his stage has been set that Chris is going to be here. He wants to be here. Guys took less money to get him here, and he's still not here. What was that deal that's being offered? I don't know if we're ever going to know if it was actually correct. But the issue that I have is I believe whatever Chris's value is, or whatever the Chiefs are offering, I believe Chris's value could be more somewhere else, and that's what he's holding on to. The problem is the gap between the number one highest paid player at $31 million with Aaron Donald, and then number two at Quentin Williams at 24. That's a very large gap, and sets up this problem to where they're going to want him closer to Aaron Donald, closer to 30. Chiefs are going to want him closer to 25, saying it's the greatest defensive tackle in NFL history, or one of the greatest in that conversation. So that sets up the problem. But I also, on the flip side, Chris, hold out, get your money, get paid. You've earned it. On the flip side, I also will never blame an organization, any organization, Chiefs or otherwise, and take the player out of it, of not making a player. I said the same thing with Tyreek Hill, not making a player the highest or second highest paid player in NFL history at his position, because I believe if you have a good front office, that the $30 million a year they could save in contracts to go to other people, plus the draft picks and trading them, I believe the totality of that could be more valuable than Chris individually as one player. Has nothing to do with Chris. It has to do with, I would believe that for any position anywhere. And that leads us to this. It's in the best interest of the Chiefs to hold still their value. It's in the best interest of Chris to know what his worth is.
Right. And what makes it so interesting is we always talk about teams, and I bring this up because there's been few reports. Payne Insider from the Bet the Board podcast with Todd Furman, a very reputable guy, had talked about how there are teams that are inquiring about Chris Jones. Mentioned Chicago as a clear example. We talked about Ryan Poles and the connection that he has. He knows Chris Jones just as well as anybody. Chicago still has the most amount of cap money over the next several years. They have Justin Fields on a rookie contract. It makes sense. Remember, a couple of years ago, they tried to get Larry Ogunjobi to be that key three technique in their defense, and he failed his physical. And it didn't look good for Ryan Poles at the time, but you don't want to commit that type of commitment to a guy that's not going to be able to stay on the field. That hasn't been an issue for Chris Jones throughout the course of his career. So you see whether or not, from a value standpoint, he might go to Chicago and get the highest amount of money, but is that what he wants? And then maybe he comes back and says, okay, I don't want to go to Chicago. I want to stay here. Let's then find an opportunity to get this done. You also brought up Tyreek Hill, which was interesting. And I think the difference was the numbers came out fairly quickly that Tyreek was not going to be happy until he was the highest paid wide receiver in the league. And the Chiefs said, we love you, but we just can't commit financially at the number that so many other guys have moved that line to. Like, the goalposts keep changing. So for Tyreek, they came to the recognition that Miami was willing to pay for him more so than the Jets, and you learned it right away. It just felt like we were all, as media members, as fans, more tuned in versus, like you said, with Chris. It's just hard to recognize. And I have to think that unless the Chiefs really felt like they went over the top in their offer, more likely than not, that's probably why you don't know the terms of that deal. Because that's usually when you start to hear a few things get leaked out. If the Chiefs feel like their number was more than fair,
it will not get leaked out, I don't think, from the Chiefs side.
Not from the Chiefs side, if it comes from the agent side.
If it was a disrespectful amount, I feel like it would have gotten leaked out from Chris's side.
Yes.
Because they're the gloves. I'm not saying the gloves are off, but from a PR standpoint, it started for me. And there could have been more stuff that Chris said or tweeted. I know he's been tweeting a lot of stuff, but the report that came out saying the Chiefs were unwilling to make Chris Jones the highest paid defensive tackle ever, that to me said one of two things. If Chris Jones' camp wasn't asking to be paid the highest paid, that was 100% a PR move to get fans saying, why is he out offering more than Aaron Donald? Why is he asking for more Aaron Donald? We don't know that that's the case. And we don't know that they're APY and they could spin the number to make it seem like he was asking for more than Aaron Donald.
The people involved in the cap office,
that was a PR. Fans are going to get on our side. They're going to turn on Chris. That was the first kind of moment where I saw something get leaked where it was like, ooh, that's not a good sign. The second I saw it, that's going to lead to something. And then Chris's side comes out, and now it's back and forth, and him saying he'll hold out to week 8, and then it just gets beyond repair. And the problem, again, if it gets done, it's Chris coming and saying, I'll accept the deal. I do not believe, and I don't know this. I don't believe it's in the best business interest of the Chiefs to change the deal that they offered, because it sets a precedent that if you hold out on the Chiefs and you're a good player, eventually they'll meet you. They'll cave. They draw a line in the sand. They say, this is our offer. We put a lot of time into this offer, and this is what it is.
In the only exception I would say to that is that when the leverage changes, I also think as a front office, you need to be willing to accept that and realize it. If they come to the realization that they need Chris more than they think they do, regardless of scheme, regardless of the guys that they can plug in, again, it's the NFL, you're going to have injuries regardless. But if they come to the realization that, okay, we might need to move and bend this offer, that doesn't have to be leaked to anybody. Nobody has to know that, maybe with the exception of Chris Jones and his camp. But if it gets the deal done and both sides walk away feeling good, ultimately that's going to be a more important thing. And it also shows a willingness from both sides to finally meet at a number that is going to work for both sides.
Yeah, for me, I want to see Chris get paid. I hope it's in Kansas City.
No doubt.
Those are like,
as a Bears fan, I would enjoy Chris in Chicago, but I don't want to do that to all of our fans here.
Yeah. And as a Chiefs fan, I don't want to see Chris go to Chicago, but if that's the way that it goes, I will be rooting so hard against Chicago the entire year so that Chiefs can end up with like Marvin Harris. Like, can you imagine the Chiefs end up with Marvin Harrison on some sort of trade? Granted, it's not going to replace Chris, but also
we'll just send you Carolina's pick, and then Carolina will outperform expectations. So everybody will actually win.
But from a narrative standpoint, we've seen, and if you watch the quarterback documentary on Netflix, Patrick Mahomes feeds off of negativity. If they trade Chris isn't there. The amount of doubt that people will the media will say they can't get it done without Chris Jones. There's no way they're going to win a Super Bowl. Patrick Mahomes will take that personally.
Of course.
And that might actually end up being a good thing for the Chiefs if we're being honest about it. But losing Tyreek Hill and then winning a Super Bowl, if they lose Chris Jones and then still go win a Super Bowl, it just becomes another line in a ridiculous resume and just explanation of how crazy Patrick Mahomes' start of his career has been.
Really quickly, just because you brought up quarterback, I know that there were folks that didn't love the idea of Mahomes like trying to find every negative and use it and just say like, well, okay, why can't you go out and win? Man, like, you know what that reminds me of? Do you remember a couple of years ago during the pandemic, The Last Dance? Who was that guy that was finding every single piece of negative news or even fabricating it just so he could have that edge? It was Michael Jordan.
We're the best competitors that we've ever seen in sports. Michael Jordan,
I love that
who on his Hall of Fame speech was calling out Byron Russell, being like, you remember what you said? And Byron Russell's like, I didn't say anything to you. I don't know what you're talking about.
It's
Kobe.
I love it.
Kobe, those are my favorite players. They weren't trying to be friends with everybody. Patrick Mahomes, after the game, respect. But yes, like, players will carry chips and find them wherever they need to. And as much as everybody's praising Patrick Mahomes and is all over him on everything, and for good reason, it's the best start to a quarterback we've seen in NFL history, finding chips and finding doubters and latching onto that stuff is exactly how they keep themselves motivated when everybody's propping them up. And he's the most recognizable athlete on the planet next to LeBron.
Yeah.
And Messi.
Yeah. And Messi is finding a way to get himself a little bit more recognized and even better. Is there a guy on this team? Because I know we're closing in on kickoff.
Yep.
Obviously cuts are coming up on Tuesday, and you're going to go from a fairly sizable number down to that 53 man. Do you anticipate a surprise cut or two from this team that maybe isn't in the realm of what traditional media members, guys here at KCSN, have been talking about that could be gone Tuesday or ahead of time?
Man, that's a tough question. There are going to be surprise cuts, but you always kind of have to, because of the injury situation, especially with like L'Jarius Sneed and a couple of these guys. Like, some players based on NFL rule will have to make the initial 53 and then will end up getting cut after, because they make the initial 53 and then they get placed on IR. They can still come back this season. They get placed on IR before their season is done. And so there's always that first round of cuts where somebody's like, holy cow, that person got cut. And then they don't get picked up on the waiver wire, which is always a risk.
Right.
And then they end up coming right back to the team. So it's like the initial 53, there's always a couple, and it's generally with a surprise veteran who doesn't have to go through waivers, who's just going to come right back. But to me, the most interesting, and it kind of goes into those players to watch that we were going to talk about, Amir Smith-Marset is going to end up, it's going to be really tough for him to make this roster, if we're being honest, looking at the numbers. Yeah. But he's a player that I'm excited, because if he can go out and perform, I don't know if there's going to be any kind of trade value for him in order for him to get cut and picked up somewhere else. But again, it's not just teams not trading a pick because of the value of the player, but it's also, where are they out on the waiver wire? What does their roster look like? Are there one or two teams out there that could really use Smith Marset, that are higher on the waiver wire, that know that if he gets cut, there's no chance that they're going to have a chance to get him. Could they just trade a 7th or get some sort of value? And whether it's Smith Marset or anybody else on this roster, there are a lot of players on the Chiefs that are going to play today for the Chiefs that are going to play in the NFL this year that isn't going to be for the Chiefs.
For sure.
They can stand out and just make it a little bit more value to where the team doesn't feel like, hey, we're going to get him on the waiver. We'll get him if we trade. Maybe the Chiefs can end up with a trade or two, some late round picks.
Smith Marset's an interesting name, particularly because of his value on special teams. But I would have to think, again, we talked about this at the beginning of the show, you can only keep so many wide receivers. At some point, you have to figure out where the value lies. And there have been only a couple guys that have done punt returns this year. It's been Amir Smith-Marset, it's been Richie James, and it's been Nico Remiglio, right? I think I said his name. Remigio. Okay, so a little bit of a soft.
Remigio. Tucker taught me that.
Is there any chance that if Smith-Marset just continues to have a blow-up camp, maybe they say to themselves, we brought in Richie for depth. We brought him because he had a really nice year in New York. Is there any chance that somebody like him might be on the block? Because maybe that's so, something that you get the value for.
I don't know how many reps Amir Smith-Marset, and this would be a good question for Nate Taylor and the guys that have been at practice every single day, but I don't know how many reps Amir Smith-Marset has been taking with the first team offense and working with Mahomes in the way that Richie James has. Richie James is making the team just based on the usage, the reps that he had, and that there were no times that he looked bad. I mean, he had in some of those nuanced things, a couple practices that I went to, I saw on some broken plays where it's just kind of that instinctual find a spot to get open, that Richie James did that. And it was kind of like off script. He moved away from the leverage, found an open spot. Mahomes found him across the middle 2 different times within one period that I was watching. And those are kind of those behind the scenes. It might not look like a whole lot, but for 2 players that hadn't had a lot of experience together, to see that is exactly what you want to see in that situation.
Right.
Let's move to the other side. Let's talk couple of defensive players that we're excited to watch in this game as we wrap it up. I know kickoff started, but Danny Shelton is a player that I'm excited to watch today. I think he has a chance to compete for a roster spot. And again, talking with Chris Jones, if he isn't there, player like Danny Shelton had some big moments, played in some big games in his career. Not the same kind of player as Chris Jones, but can absolutely make an impact with his humongous body there in the middle of your defense.
Yeah, and if you read over at kcsportsnetwork.com, the preview article from Wes, he brought up a couple of those names that you mentioned with Shelton. I think when it comes to trying to evaluate what the defensive line looks like, it's still fun for me to know that you could have this gaping hole in the middle of that line, and now it's really about where that depth is going to come from, where the rotations are going to come from, who's going to come in, who's going to come out, especially on third down. So whether it's Shelton, whether it's Malik Herring, I just want to see more of an impact on the line, so that Chiefs fans can walk away from this game. Again, it's a meaningless game, and it's a 7.5 point move from where the Chiefs opened as favorites to now a 5-point dog. I just think when it comes to determining like where those holes in your roster are going to be, I think from a fan base perspective, that's where you get excited. So that's where I want to see a little bit more of a rotation. That's where I want to see a little bit more of an impact. But I do think Herring is probably at this point safe for now. But he's had a really nice preseason too.
Awesome. Well, that's all we've got for this live pregame show. We thank our friends here at PXG Overland Park. Again, if you're in the market for some new clubs, if you're in for some swag, or you just want to do a fitting and come and go through the process, learn a little bit more about your swing and what really quality equipment can do for your golf game, whether you're an every weekend golfer or an couple of times a year, 3 times a year golfer like
we gotta you swinging those clubs, because I clean mine. Like, I'm still at the point where I'm cleaning my clubs because I hate to see them dirty. Just take a little bit of warm water and soap, and then you still feel like you got those brand new, perfectly polished clubs that you got from PXG.
We didn't have either a game or a practice for one of our 2 kids every single day. I would probably golf a little bit more, or getting ready for the season. Right. A busy time. We've got a lot of stuff coming up, really cool things coming on at KC Sports Network. We'll have you covered. Enjoy the game. Again, thanks to our friends, Alex, Jacob, and everybody here at PXG for taking care of us. Enjoy the game. We'll have our live post-game show after. We'll see you then.